Audio's rolling, camera's rolling. All right, Tim. Action.
Hello, my name's Tim Malone, and I'm a retired history teacher and a minor league historian. And I've done a series of lectures on American history for my YouTube channel, Tim Malone History Lectures on YouTube. And today, I want to do something that I've been thinking about doing since the beginning of this lecture series. Because in the lectures that I've given, I've mentioned the fact that I have in my possession, even in retirement, I have lots of history, American history textbooks. In fact, here's some we're going to talk about today. Again, I don't think in every lecture, there's some 20 up at my YouTube channel right now. Not in every one, but in most of them, I mentioned the fact that I have 30 different American history textbooks. And here's 6 of them right here. And we're going to talk about these today, and we're going to talk about history textbooks in general. Now, I taught for 25 years American history, mostly the survey classes, at Elgin Community College in Elgin, Illinois, where I taught for those years. Every semester, I had my students buy a textbook. Mostly, it's out of many here. We'll talk about Farragher's book. I used that for most of the years I taught. And it was standard operating procedure for a class like mine, first half, second half of American history, to have a textbook. Although I rarely consulted the textbook in class. Amongst historians and history teachers, it's, well, to paraphrase that movie, I don't need no stinking textbook to teach American history. It was, as I explained to the students the first day of class, it was supplemental. It was to fill in the gaps because I lectured topically. I lectured about topics that interested me, that I thought were relevant to the times my students live in, that would abet their analysis. The textbook was supplemental. Now, you might say, well, they're awfully expensive for being supplemental, and I agree, but still, it was just reflex, I guess, that I had my students buy a textbook every semester. But I'm in the camp of, I don't need no stinking textbook to teach American history. I'm an expert in and of myself. Now, just one time in 25 years, or maybe it was twice, and on the after class, last day of class evaluation, the students would evaluate me. A couple of times I had students say, he didn't teach from the textbook. And it's like, I didn't say it, but I thought it. If you had a teacher, a history teacher, at any level who taught from the textbook, I feel sorry for you. I had a teacher like that in high school, in world history, that literally sat at his desk with the textbook open and flipped pages. I feel sorry for you if that ever happened to you. You obviously were not being taught by an expert if they taught from the book. But at any rate, they're ubiquitous, history textbooks. And here, today, I'm going to talk about them some. And I'm going to zero in on the Progressive era because it's a good example of how textbooks vary in their coverage of major topics in American history, Progressivism. Now, I have a lecture on my YouTube channel on Progressivism that I encourage you to view. There'll be some repetition in this video about how textbooks handle progressivism and my lecture on progressivism. But that's okay. Reiteration is part of education. But what I have here today is, and let me go through this, all right? Here's Alan Brinkley's American History. Now, Alan Brinkley is the most popular, the most high-selling textbook in American history. Alan Brinkley. This is all these are old because I'm entering my 7th year of retirement, so I haven't gotten a new textbook for 7 years. But they'd send them to me as an instructor at Elgin Community College unsolicited. I'd go to my mailbox at Elgin Community College, and there'd be a textbook. The publisher would send them to me. I didn't want them. I didn't request them. They just send them to me. And I have 30 different ones at home, and here's 6 of them. Alan Brinkley, the highest selling textbook author, and what's interesting is that he's the sole author. Most of these, there'll be 3 or 4 or more cited authors. Brinkley, I guess, does his own. And, I mean, look at this thing. I mean, a lot of these are works of art and have works of art in them. They're maps and art from the era. And, I mean, these things are, in some ways, remarkable. They're remarkable works with just all kinds of information in them. I mean, I'm impressed. Again, as works of art, jam-packed with information. Now, of course, 70 years ago, and I have some old history textbooks from that era, there were almost no pictures, an occasional map. They were black and white. As the medium has changed, as video and images became more ubiquitous in education, the books, less text and more graphics, maps, charts, works of art. I mean, you know, these things, I'm impressed. Although, again, you know, I didn't use them much in class. But here's Brinkley. We'll talk about Brinkley. Here's Mark Carnes and John Garrity. Now, again, Brinkley I'd heard about, right? Most of these people I knew by reputation. Carnes and Garrity. This is a paperback version. But again, you know, there's a picture on every, and captions, pictures and captions. And again, very impressive projects. Here's one by Conlon, America's Past, a survey of American history, that in an effort to make the book cheaper, which there's various, you know, like Brinkley, this is the main Brinkley textbook, right? Connecting with the past, but he'd also have a cheaper version of this that wasn't as colorful, that wasn't, you know, maybe black and white, or here's one by Conlon where everything is kind of blue. This is supposed to be cheaper because it's not color. But again, still an impressive effort. And again, let me make this point. In the history video on my YouTube channel, where I talk about history as a discipline, I talk about how historians generalize, condense, and distill the past, make it usable in the present. Well, these things, and here's Farragher's book, the one I used for all those years, various editions of them, compress and distill. Here's American history from the beginning up till, oh, I don't know, this is probably a 2012 volume here. Compress and distill. I mean, look, this is American history, a version of American history, 240 some years. Talk about compressing and distilling a topic, but that's what historians do. Again, you know, they're just chock full of interesting pictures and photographs and art. I mean, I mean, you know, here's a chart, a graph, and a piece of art from the period of the chapter. I'm impressed. Here's another one. Liberty, Equality, and Power, A History of the American People, primarily by, what's his first name? John Murin. But there's one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine authors to this book. Now, Brinkley, by himself. That's unusual. 9 people contributed to this book. Murin, he was the feudal revival in the countryside before the American Revolution guy. I'd heard of him, of course. 7th edition. Again, this is probably from 2012, 2013. This is 10 years old. And then here's the final one we're going to be talking about today. The American People, Creating a Nation and a Society by Nash. Again, he's a relatively famous American historian. And again, just incredible documents in some way. But again, it's like there's a prejudice amongst the teaching profession in history against textbooks. And despite the artistic beauty of some of these things, they're problematic, as you could probably guess, because, of course, history is contentious. And historians and their textbooks are judged politically, not surprisingly. And in fact, that battle over what to put in history textbooks is very prominent right now. We're in January of 2025 when I'm taping this. And there's battles in states, now more so on the high school, grade school and high school level than on the community college level where I taught or the university level. But there too, as to what to put in and what to leave out. Because again, these are compressed generalizations. Now, most of them are very similar. In fact, there's probably 3 or 4 of these that have the Progressive Era as chapter 21. It's the same number. The chapter, in other words, there's a accepted structure to American history, and my videos, my lectures on my YouTube channel follow that convention, right? American Revolution, early national period, the age of Jackson, pre-Civil War, Civil War, Reconstruction. That's all pretty much set. There's only 1 or 2 of the 30 textbooks that I have that break that basic chapter structure. And again, like I said, some of them, the chapters turn out to have the same numbers in them. So I'm going to talk today about how these 6 textbooks treat the Progressive Era, which is a highly contested period in American history. From 1900 to 1917 is usually how it's dated. And most of these textbooks go with that convention. From 1900 or 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, after McKinley. After McKinley is shot, assassinated, his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, becomes president, and thus kicks off the Progressive Era. And it goes until American entry into World War I in 1917. So these are the books we're going to look at. Now, Brinkley has the title page of the chapter on Progressivism, which we'll put up, right? He highlights the women's rights aspect of progressivism. Progressivism and women's rights. I want to talk about that. First wave feminism. The battle for the right of women to vote culminates in 1919 in the adoption of the 19th Amendment, the right for women to vote. Now, in other words, believe it or not, there's still people alive today who were alive when women, half the population, couldn't vote. in federal elections. In some states they could, but very few of those. And so, and again, these are generalizations. That's generally considered first wave feminism. And once the 19th Amendment is enacted and women can vote, the women's rights movement, or the issue of women's rights in the United States, sort of goes into quiescence. It sort of drops in salience in the discussion of American history. It comes again when we talk about second wave feminism in the 1960s, Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, second wave feminism in the 1950s and 1960s. And some people say we're talking about third wave feminism now, and some people even talk about fourth wave feminism. I don't want to get into that here. There's one of these books, I'll get into that in a minute. Here's what Brinkley has to say. The prominence of women in the reform movement, progressivism, is one of the most striking features of progressivism. The phenomenon of the new woman was widely remarked upon at the time. First wave feminism. Brinkley has a picture of a poster, we'll show it to you, as the introduction page to the chapter on progressivism. He gives it high marks. Now, my recollection from high school and survey in college is that no, back in the 1960s and 1970s, when I was studying American history, women's rights wasn't the prominent aspect of progressivism, like Brinkley says it is in his book. It was barely mentioned. Here's more from Brinkley. Perhaps the largest single reform movement of the progressive era, indeed one of the largest in American history, was the fight for women's suffrage. Again, highly prominent in Brinkley's distillation of American history. What's the number one, what's the headline in the progressive movement? The struggle for women's suffrage, according to Brinkley. Conlon says Teddy Roosevelt was ambivalent towards women's suffrage. Woodrow Wilson, according to Brinkley, refused to support women's suffrage. Woodrow Wilson. Because again, consider, we're going to talk about this in a minute, and I talk about it on my YouTube channel about progressivism. Some analysis pretty much reduces progressivism to the three so-called progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Wilson is a progressive president, but did not back women's suffrage. You're beginning to see the nuance here in a historical interpretation. In Carnes's book, here, there's almost no mention of the women's rights aspect of progressivism. Brinkley, it's number one. Carnes barely mentions it. Another aspect of progressivism for whites only. Progressivism is racist. Now, I know I mentioned this in my lecture on the YouTube channel, but I want to come back and emphasize it. The progressive era coincided with the years of greatest segregation in the South. Over 1,000 blacks were lynched between 1901 and 1914, the so-called progressive era. Progressivism was for whites. Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification. Some of these talk about, because it's during the progressive era that the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is founded. There is agitation by African Americans for greater rights during the progressive era, but nothing really is done. It's all talk. The eugenics movement is strong during the progressive era. Margaret Sanger, the champion of birth control for women. Margaret Sanger, who had to flee the country because her little newspaper published an anatomically correct illustration of the women's reproductive tract, and she was arrested for pornography. You couldn't print an anatomically correct illustration of women's reproductive system without being charged with pornography during the Progressive era. Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. She thought that inferior people, and there's a tinge of racism here, right, should be sterilized. Should be not just discouraged from having children, but blocked from having children. The eugenics movement, Margaret Sanger, for example, immigration, over 14 million during the Progressive era. 14 million. This is a country of about 100 million people. During the 17 years of the Progressive era, 14 million immigrants came into the country out of a population of about 100 million. And it led ultimately to post-World War I immigration restrictions. But even prominent progressives were disturbed by the influx of what they considered to be genetically inferior people. I want to once again stress the Progressive era's impact on education, scientific management, the expert, the college degree. It's during the Progressive era that the bachelor, master's, PhD, which was from Germany, was brought to the United States higher education, and it's still there. The college degree, graduate school, progressive education reform is still with us. The high school is a progressive education reform. Now, some cynics, some critics of the system say, well, yeah, they added high school because they wanted to keep kids out of the factories. But that's all it was, the high school. Manage the workforce. I don't know about that. Again, I want to come back to the progressives president. Were any of them really progressives? We already saw Teddy Roosevelt didn't back women's suffrage strongly. Same true of Wilson. Taft, in between them for 4 years, was deemed so unprogressive that Teddy Roosevelt came out of retirement to run against him, and thus threw the election in 2012 to Woodrow Wilson. Conlin has a chapter, The Age of Reform of the Progressives, and then a whole second chapter on the progressive presidents. He takes this idea that we should think of progressivism as 3 presidents, which really, progressivism to a large degree happened on the state and local level. In fact, it started in the cities, went to the states, particularly like Wisconsin, and then to the federal government. It was a grassroots movement to start with. But again, compressing and distilling, a lot of historians want to boil it down to 3 presidents: Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And Conlin breaks progressivism into 2 chapters, progressivism and then the progressive presidents. But all of them kind of go the president's route. About Taft, Conlin has a major chapter subtitled A Conservative President in a Progressive Era. He calls Taft a conservative. Now again, I think you can make a case that all 3 of them were really conservatives and were fake, bogus progressives. We're progressive for political reasons because the ism, the movement, the ethos had so penetrated the polity. In 1912, the famous election of 1912, when the Republicans split, Roosevelt goes against the incumbent Taft, splits the Republican vote, and thus Woodrow Wilson wins. That election is called the progressive election, because Eugene Debs, the socialist, is in there too, getting 1 million and some votes. Taft was a conservative man, much less a progressive than Roosevelt. That's Murin. Then Nash writes, in some ways, Taft seemed more progressive than Roosevelt. So, interpretation, history's interpretation. Who's the most progressive of these? Taft more progressive than Roosevelt? Wilson more progressive than either one of them? Wilson more conservative than either? You can get a wide array of interpretations of progressivism. That's why I guess I find it interesting, progressivism, because it still resonates today. I call myself a progressive. And what does that mean? Well, that means I think that we can make the future better than the present. Progressivism, progress. Human beings, human societies, human governments can make things better. The greatest good for the greatest number. Progressivism. Now, Gabriel Kolko, not one of these textbook writers, wrote a famous book, The Triumph of Conservatism, makes a distinctly revisionist argument that business conservatism was at the heart of the progressive movement in The Triumph of Conservatism, 1963. That's a quote from Brinkley. Brinkley quotes Kolko. Triumph of Conservatism, that it's the rich who want progressive reforms because there's too much turmoil. There's too many I spent a lot of years in DeKalb, going to Northern Illinois University, and of course DeKalb is the birthplace of barbed wire. And so I did some barbed wire research, and it's a classic example of Kolko, in Kolko's argument that there's too many barbed wire manufacturers, and U.S. Steel bought them all up, put them all out of business, and there came to be one barbed wire, Glidden Barb, the kind I dealt with on the farm that I grew up on, Glidden Barb. And if you go to the Barbed Wire Museum in DeKalb, you can see all the different barbed wires. No, one barbed wire. That's what businessmen wanted, and they called themselves progressive for getting rid of the chaos of multiple barbed wires. Kolko, he's famous for his, progressivism. It was all a put-up job. Okay, we'll give women the vote, but there's only going to be one barbed wire. Interesting. Wilson had a lifelong opposition to women's suffrage. We talked about that before. So how progressive can you be if you don't want women to vote? Which Brinkley says highlights as the number one aspect of progressivism. So again, talking about progressivism and talking about the progressive presidents, to focus in even more, is a classic example of the different interpretations one gets from the study of American history. And I guess that's one of the points I want to make with this video. Interpretive differences. And they come through even in something that's supposedly bland, right? I mean, these textbooks, one of the general features of them that most historians agree on is that they try to avoid controversy. They want to sell to the great middle. They don't want someone to say, what do you mean Wilson wasn't a progressive? Although they do that. It's interesting. It's an example of how history works if you look at these closely. Now I want to talk about socialism and progressivism. The main section, there's a main section in Brinkley, chapter, The Progressives, is titled Challenging the Capitalist Order. That progressives challenged the capitalist order. Now again, we're talking about Gabriel Kolko's The Triumph of Conservatism, who would say the progressives weren't challenging capitalism, they were perfecting it. They were getting rid of all the little barbed wire manufacturers. Challenging the capitalist order. If there is one issue that overshadowed and helped to shape all the others in the minds of progressives, it was the growing power and influence, and also reformers believed corruption, of corporate America. Wow. The main, again, women's suffrage, and then Brinkley goes, the main thrust of progressivism was to get rid of the corrupt influence of capital, of large corporations, of Andrew Carnegie and Vanderbilt and James Jerome Hill and J.P. Morgan. The robber barons. I mean, that's a term that comes during the progressive era, the robber barons. And one of the great reforms of the progressive era is the income tax, aimed right at those guys. The income tax, with the 16th Amendment, was a progressive reform. And well, that's, you know, the progressivism was a capitalist plot, Coco says, and it's like, wait a minute, the income tax? Capital hates the income tax and still does to this day, right? 80 years, no, over 100 years, 110 years of hating the income tax? It might be the greatest reform of the progressive era, the income tax. Challenging the capitalist order. The title of the progressive chapter in Nash is titled "The Progressives Confront Industrial Capitalism." The title of the progressive chapter in Nash is "The Progressives Confront Industrial Capitalism." Wow, did they? Yes, I think. Brinkley has a section in his chapter on progressivism called "The Dream of Socialism." He dedicates an entire subsection of his progressive chapter on socialism. If there was one issue that overshadowed and helped shape all of the other minds reformers, it was the growing power, influence, and corruption of corporate America. Boy, we could use a new progressive era. Here's Murin. At no time in the history of the United States to that point, and seldom after, did radical critiques of the capitalist system attract more support than during the progressive era. Radical critiques of the capitalist system drew more support in the progressive era than any other time. The Socialist Party of America grew during these years into a force of considerable strength. Socialists won elections in over 1,000 state and local offices. During the progressive era, socialists won 1,000 local and state races. From my perspective in Northern Illinois, the most prominent was Milwaukee, which was ruled by socialist mayors for, well, into the 40s, into the 50s. The utilities in Milwaukee were owned by the city. You sent your water bill, well, water systems are socialized almost everywhere to this day. Water is considered, see, this is the progressive thinking. Water, electricity, sewage disposal are considered so essential that they shouldn't be done for profit. Oh, I'm a commie, you know? But just about everybody in America agrees with that in water. You know, everybody says you can't have capitalist profit maximizers running your water supply system. That has to be done by the government to the benefit of everyone. But I don't know what the same thing should be true of electricity. Socialize electricity. Why is there an intermediary, profit seekers, capitalists, between the generation of electricity and the delivery to customers? It's as important as water, isn't it? You should send your electric bill to City Hall, just like you send your water bill to City Hall. And gas, natural gas. That's all starts with progressivism and its socialist ideas. And public ownership and regulation, we got regulation, right? Supposedly, the Illinois Commerce Commission regulates Commonwealth Edison. Not very well, in my opinion. It's a half-assed solution, regulatory capitalism. The Socialist Party of America, founded in 1901, became a political force during the Progressive era, and socialist ideas influenced progressivism. No duh. Socialist ideas. Socialist ideas from the Progressive era will influence the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt, and will lead us to Social Security and welfare. Progressive/socialist ideas. Progressives, and now Carnes here, progressives never challenged the fundamental principles of capitalism, nor did they attempt a basic reorganization of society. The exact opposite in this one. They never challenged, whereas, who was it, Brinkley? Brinkley's main section is called Challenging the Capitalist Order. Brinkley says that. Carnes said they never challenged the capitalist order. Again, differences in interpretation. Now, I think you know where I stand. Yes, they did. And there's a book by Walter Karp, The Politics of War, that highlights the crucial role World War I played in crushing progressives. I mean, Eugene Debs, the head of the Socialist Party, founded in 1901, and then won 1,000 elections across the country during the Progressive era, ends up in jail because he opposes the war, Wilson's War, World War I. How World War I crushed progressivism. Well, not entirely, of course, because we're still, this battle, right, between progressives, socialists, progressives versus capitalists is with us to this day. So, I just wanted to make a video to talk about textbooks generally and specifically how they differ and how they can present tangled views and contradictory views of American history. So, thanks.